Okay, great. So thank you everyone so much for joining. This is a Knowledge Bites webinar on leveraging employee ownership as a business recovery strategy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Lang. I manage the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which is a program at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. The Southern Vermont Economy Project provides webinars, mini summits, technical assistance, training around advancing local economic and community development projects. And if you visit that website there, it's got a whole bunch of information on past and upcoming trainings. Knowledge Bites is part of the trainings that we put on, and it's really meant to be just introductory information around economic and community development tools, such as this one. And we have an archive of all the past topics. You can find that at that website that you see on your screen. So today we have Matt from the Vermont Employee Ownership Center who will be presenting today, and then we have guest speaker Deb Harris who will be giving sort of her point of view and her experience going through this process. So I'm going to stop sharing, Matt, and you can go ahead and share your screen and begin.
Great. All right. Fire up my slides here. And let's do present. There we go. The big button, right?
Yep.
Great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share this information. So as you mentioned, I'm Matt Kropp. I'm co-executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. Kind of a quick overview summary of the agenda for today, what we're going to cover. So talk a little bit about who we are, what we do. We'll talk about, so we work with what we refer to as broad-based employee ownership. So we'll define that and talk about a few of the kind of most common modes of cutting employees in on ownership of the business where they work, and talk a little bit about what are both generally the motivations for implementing employee ownership, but then and also some COVID-specific considerations given both the economic environment and some of the kind of quirks of just the level of uncertainty right now and how to kind of manage that when thinking about using employee ownership. Then we're gonna, we'll dig a bit more deeply into specifically the worker cooperative model, and I'll get into kind of the reasons why we see that as kind of a key tool of the moment, and including both just how they work and then kind of buying a business as a worker co-op. Then I'll pass it to Deb kind of at the beginning of the Q&A to tell a little bit about their story as an employee-owned cooperative. They're a physical therapy co-op that has several locations and have been pretty successful with the model. And then, and then we'll just kind of go into if you have any questions or comments about, we can go into that for the remainder of the hour. So, 501c3 nonprofit. We were inspired by a similar organization that's operated since the 80s in Ohio, the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. We're funded through a mixture of, we do an annual conference with sponsors, we do some fee-for-service, that's a fairly minor part of our work, and we get a pretty substantial grant that's about half our budget from the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. So we're pretty well embedded into the economic development world here, and ACCD really sees employee ownership as a tool for both retaining good jobs as in terms of an ownership succession strategy, and advancing on some other kind of key goals. So we have 3 staff, 2 full-time equivalents. We briefly had an office, so we still technically do, but back to working remotely as most of us are. And our mission is to promote and foster employee ownership for these kinds of impact reasons, right? Broadening capital ownership, giving more people the opportunity to own the business or piece of the business where they work, deepening employee participation, retaining jobs, increasing living standards for working families, and stabilizing communities. So when we say, there's a lot of different ways you can think about and ways that employees can own a piece of their business. So we to a certain extent, we'll deal with many of them, but we really kind of focus our efforts on what we define as broad-based employee ownership. and that is ownership of a business, directly or indirectly, in part or in whole, by a broad cross-section of the employees, including non-managerial employees, with the expectation that all full-time hires will have the opportunity to eventually become owners. This doesn't mean that you hire someone, they immediately become a co-owner of the business, but rather that there's a path to it, so it's not simply key employees or a few managers or something like that, but everyone can kind of have a slice of the pie once they've kind of worked there for a certain amount of time. So the two most common forms that we work with are the employee stock ownership plan and the worker cooperative. So we're going, as I mentioned, we're going to focus more on the worker cooperative today. So I'll say a little bit about the ESOP here. So ESOP companies are essentially, it's a form of employee ownership in which the retirement plan owns the business. So essentially, the company makes pre-tax contributions to something that looks like a 401k, but that the purpose of which is to own company stock. Folks accumulate those shares. And then if they leave, they're kind of cashed out over time, or when they retire, they're cashed out more quickly. It's a form that's been around in part of American retirement law since the 1970s. There's, I think last estimate, 6,000 to 7,000 ESOPs around the country, and a number of fairly prominent Vermont companies have this, with such names as PC Construction, King Arthur Flour, Gardner Supply Company. There's 30 some ESOP companies that are headquartered in Vermont. One of the things to be aware of about ESOPs is that while they have some great tax benefits, they're also, as a retirement plan, highly regulated. And so there's a certain level of kind of overhead necessary to bring one of these into existence or implement at your company. And that creates kind of a floor on the scale of a business that can do this. About maybe 20 employees is our kind of rule of thumb. It's not a hard rule. You can do a feasibility study, and there's some cases where you can go smaller than that. But I'd say, you're pretty safe once it's about 20 employees and $3 million in enterprise value. And the tax savings at that point can oftentimes start to offset some of the setup and administrative costs, but you're talking usually for setup, maybe $100,000 to $200,000, legal fees, trustee costs, feasibility assessments, valuations, all of that. Worker co-ops, which we'll get into, are because they're not part of the retirement system, they don't have a lot of that red tape around them, and so they're viable for much smaller companies, but not only smaller companies. And then there's a few other forms, of bespoke ownership. One in the Southern Vermont region that's pretty well known is Chroma Technologies. They have kind of a direct stock ownership scheme where people sort of build their ownership over time. So there's a lot of things where you can go to a lawyer and say, this is what I want to achieve with ownership, and I want folks to broaden it. But the employee stock ownership plan and the worker co-op are kind of the two most commonly used templates for achieving this goal of all full-time employees having a stake in the business. So when we think about kind of the benefits of employee ownership, there's these kind of four main categories we think of, right? So in terms of benefits to the community, there's a variety, and this is kind of where it fits in the economic development world, right? Kind of preserving local ownership of jobs, particularly if you have a business where a lot of those employees have a direct stake. The odds are they're going to be less likely to want to move their business to another community to get a marginally different tax break, that sort of thing. There's deeper community commitment, and the fact that you have this economic engine building equity for all the folks who work there decreases economic inequality, makes people more economically secure, right? So, and for those employees, that greater economic security is really shown. ESOP companies, a lot of studies have shown folks will retire with 2 to 3 times the assets of their peers in similar industries and similar roles in non-ESOP companies. And then there's also opportunities for engagement at work where both, and we'll talk a little bit about productivity later, but even just work being potentially having this additional meaning, and that you have a stake in the outcome of the company beyond your role. For the company, there's again a lot of studies that show when you have broad-based employee ownership, there's improved productivity, both for the obvious intuitive reason of if the company's more profitable, everyone shares in that success. But then also you have things like mutual monitoring, where not only are you responsible for your success, or your coworkers responsible, so folks feel this level of accountability to their coworkers that can be deeper. They often see decreases in absentee turnover. Folks tend to stay at employee-owned companies longer and can think about building more of it as a, more likely to see it as an opportunity to build a career. And then oftentimes there's some tax benefits depending on kind of how you approach the employee ownership. And then for selling owners, in more kind of conventional times when we see interest, it's oftentimes at the sort of exit of the owner, thinking about selling or retiring. Although they don't always say exit and then leave. So sometimes we'll see the selling owner on the buy side of the transaction as well. But so selling owners can have a variety of goals, right? It can be as simple as diversifying the personal wealth. They own a business. 90% of their net worth is in one asset, and they're getting closer to retirement and should be reducing their risk profile. And so, selling the business or part of the business can be a liquidity event that can allow them to meet those goals. Maximizing after-tax proceeds. So both worker co-ops and ESOPs have the 1042 rollover, which allows the seller of that business to take the proceeds and put it in qualified replacement property, which is very similar to a real estate rollover, where then the capital gains taxes are deferred. And that can be actually a powerful estate planning tool because those taxes then are essentially put to or pass into the estate on a stepped up basis. So particularly for folks kind of late in life retiring, that can be a pretty powerful tool. We see it more with bigger companies just because that's when it's smaller, people are often kind of using the proceeds to cover their retirement, but that's a tool to be aware of. Reducing risk exposure. So sometimes, especially for smaller business owners, when they're beyond that diversification consideration, there's also the fact that a lot of small business owners have personal guarantee and are on the hook with their house if things go south, right? So the amount of downside, especially again as you're getting later on in life, can be quite large if things take a turn for the worse. And so shifting to an employee ownership structure where it's not their personal assets on the hook is oftentimes a motivation we see. Controlling the timing of succession and transfer can be a big one, where in some cases you can with an employee ownership or internal sale, the business owner's not responding to an outside offer, and especially if there's some seller financing involved, they can kind of control the timeline and control sort of how quick they're paid, which can also be a tax consideration as well. And similarly, into that controlling the timing is controlling your role in the company. So that business owner might want to stay on as the CEO for another 5 or 10 years, but not as the sole owner of the business. And so this can be a way to kind of stagger out that timing. And certainly kind of there can be opportunities to sort of reward and retain key management or employees. If you're at a point where there's folks who are really skilled, that have been built up under your company, and they're kind of looking, but they sort of see a ceiling of what's possible with given the existing ownership structure. Shifting to allow them to have a stake in the business can be sometimes the difference between retaining that talent and seeing them go off to greener pastures that have more upward mobility potential. And then finally, a lot of folks have concerns about legacy, right? Because these businesses are often kind of key pieces of our communities and have been around sometimes for multiple generations. And the question of what path you take, are you going to do something that looks like kind of a roll up where maybe those jobs disappear, the name changes, it goes away, versus something where you can kind of see almost the employee group as the next step in a family or community legacy, where the business kind of goes on with that sort of those deep community connections. So those are a lot of the things we see kind of from folks who are just thinking about ownership succession in normal times. And then so a few considerations or things that in this kind of COVID era moment kind of add some nuance and complexity, but also I think some opportunities to the mix. So here's 3 that I want to talk about a little bit. The first is high unemployment, right? We've seen the economy take a nosedive. There's debates over are we at 13% unemployment? Are we at 19% unemployment? How is that going to sort of shake out in the next couple of quarters? Again, we're in this just moment of great uncertainty. But whether you're on the low or the high end, we're still really high compared to when we were looking at 2 to 3% unemployment 6 months or a year ago. And so especially for smaller businesses with the ESOP model, folks are, it's something that is very much owner driven. But with these smaller businesses where the employees are going to be putting some skin directly in the game, there's a serious consideration around, when thinking about this as a possibility, like, is this appealing? Do I see myself with a kind of long-term future at this company? Or is this something where I want to, I can easily, jump to another job at, $3 an hour, more, higher pay in 6 months, and, the level of commitment's lower. So is it worth putting the effort into to explore this? And we've been certainly seeing, since the crisis hit, a lot more kind of employee interest in this, in terms of that kind of idea of, like, the security of being a co-owner of the business and kind of having something as, that I can see a longer term future in when the future is uncertain, is something that folks are, I think, maybe willing to put more energy into now than they would, when unemployment was 2%. A second piece is this kind of question of, all right, so as we come out of the depths of the crisis and are looking at recovery, what are the advantages that having a workforce of co-owners can give a company? Certainly, like, I've been hearing stories from our existing employee-owned companies of really the sort of high level of trust and collegiality that can develop with a kind of high performance employee ownership culture, meaning that folks are able to have the sort of real hard conversations of what work needs to be done to sort of pull out of the crisis, right? Is it something where the group can kind of come to an agreement around, all right, we need to take a pay cut for a little while. We need to change how we work, or and there's certainly hard conversations that are going to be hard no matter the ownership structure. But that fact of that if things can be pulled together well, that folks will share in the upside rather than simply kind of having it be a more oppositional thing, can, I think, be a pretty powerful tool in kind of giving a company an edge in a time when there's a lot of competitors dropping out, markets shrinking, but also niches opening up, and the ability to kind of both survive, persevere, and really kind of grind through and be well positioned to recover strong is something that having those that kind of committed and aligned workforce of owners can be a really powerful tool. And then finally, this kind of question of valuation, right? The uncertainty of this moment, it's been fascinating to just kind of see kind of time horizons shrink when the crisis first hits. Like, how do you plan even a month or two out, because we don't know the future? And so much of how the valuation of businesses tends to work is through essentially looking at historical performance data and saying, all right, for the last 3 years or last 5 years, what was your free cash flow? We'll apply a multiple dependent that's based on what other businesses in your sector tend to sell for, and there's in a very, very rough sense, there's how your valuation is structured. When the future for many industries is suddenly looking radically different than the past 5 years because of how the world is changing so quickly, it's pretty challenging, to come up with what is a legitimate valuation for this business, right? And so this has actually been a challenge, particularly we've been hearing for ESOPs, because the value or the price is pretty highly regulated, and so a lot of folks whose job it is to come up with that value are nervous about, like, what if we do it wrong, and then in retrospect, we get in trouble for it. This is one of the reasons why we see the kind of co-op model as more kind of more opportune for the moment, because there's more flexibility there. And particularly, I think that within internal sales, there's a lot of talk around, and we'll get into this a little bit more, using things like earnouts as a way to deal with kind of uncertainty around valuation, where a selling owner can have part of the sale price be seller financed in such a way that if the business recovers, they get to share in a significant portion of the upside. And having a strong, motivated, aligned workforce of people who also want to see the business recover because they'll share in the upside too, I think is an opportunity for business owners to, potentially maximize the value they'd receive versus either, selling at a fire sale price or kind of trying to take this on more or less all on their own. So I'll stop for just a sec to see if there's any kind of questions people want to throw at me before we get into the specifics of the worker co-op model. Let's see.
Hey, Matt, I wonder just at some point if probably maybe after you're done presenting, if we could just go around and have people sort of say their name and, what they're associated with, just so we understand.
That'd be great. And then if there's any questions that come up, we can kind of do a round of that. Perfect. Yeah. All right. So, just looking. Yeah, okay. All right. So what is a worker cooperative? And we'll I'll go into some of the details of what it is, and then we'll hear from someone who's been working who helped found and has been working for for a number of years in one. So cooperatives are it's a pretty broad category. There's all sorts of kinds of cooperatives. The most broad definition is a business owned and democratically controlled by its members for their common good. So you can see a food co-op, which is owned by customers or members. Like agricultural cooperatives, like say Cabot Creamery, are owned by the folks who sell their sell their milk or market their product through the co-op. In the case of a worker co-op, membership is limited to people who work in the business. There's about 500 nationally at last count, around 18 identified in Vermont. And so the core idea is each co-op member buys a share and is therefore a direct co-owner of the business. Those members, each share has a vote attached to it, and so the members elect, from a governance perspective, elect the board of directors, and they share in profit on the basis of usually hours worked or W-2 income. So someone works, most co-ops in Vermont that we've surveyed do hours worked, so folks will earn a market rate wage usually for whatever their position is, and then if there's any profit, that profit's divided up dependent on their labor contribution. Whatever the metric you use, it's kind of a proxy for the amount of labor they've contributed to the company. So management can be flat in terms of, some people think of co-ops and think, okay, well, it's everyone's kind of sitting in a circle and doing consensus, and there's some small co-ops that actually do that, but most that we're aware of tend to have more traditional hierarchical management structure, where there's kind of key difference or key thing to communicate is that on the one hand, every member is a co-owner. From a governance perspective, they vote for the board of directors. The board of directors sets strategy and supervises the management. But in terms of day-to-day operations, they're accountable to their supervisor in the same way as more kind of traditionally owned company. And as I mentioned, they're certainly much less expensive to set up, probably by an order of magnitude than ESOP. So they can work for small companies. Really, can go down to 3. I'd say probably 5 is a good general floor in terms of number of employees, just so you don't have the risk of losing one person and a lot of capacity and all that. But very small companies can use this model. So legally, there's kind of at the federal level, there's some specific tax treatment for them, but legally they can be any number of structures. So Vermont has some that are kind of LLCs with special operating agreements. You can have C corporations as long as they conform to certain standards. They work. And then Vermont actually does have a worker cooperative corporation statute that a company can incorporate under itself. One thing that when people think about these, oftentimes conceptually they think, oh, it's like a partnership, right? And in some ways that parallel rings true, but in other ways it doesn't. And one of the key way is this kind of this question of the cost of the share price. So it's because the key is it's not linked to the value of the company, which is one of the things that reduces the overhead compared to an ESOP, which has to do with valuation every year, but rather it's priced to kind of balance a sense of skin in the game for everyone with accessibility to the low end of the pay scale. And in some co-ops, they'll allow folks to buy their share kind of on installments through payroll deduction over the course of a few years. But really the key goal is you want it to be something that anyone who's worked at the company for a certain amount of time has the ability to buy in. There's one fairly kind of well-known co-op, construction company called South Mountain Company, where their official kind of share price is the cost of a good used car, because it's not insignificant to the folks who work there, but at the same time, it's like if anyone really needs to come up with money to get a good used car in their workforce, like they can do it. So the way that the employees kind of build wealth from the co-op is through the sharing of profits. Because that share price doesn't change usually; it's usually bought back at face value. But as profits are generated by the co-op, the member usually receives some in cash as just essentially what feels like a bonus, and then some are retained in their name as working capital, and so each member builds up an internal capital account. And so when they leave, the co-op buys back their share, and then will usually pay out their internal capital account over a period of years. And then in terms of actually becoming a member, most co-ops don't let someone become a member off day one. Really, they want to work with the person. The person joins as an employee first. They want to work with them, get a sense of if they're a good fit, do some education, understand, is this something you want to be part of long term? And then after that eligibility period, they're offered the opportunity to join. And we've seen eligibility periods from between 1 and 5 years. Really depends on the industry and company and culture to figure out how long do people feel like they need to work with someone and before they're comfortable with them being a co-owner. So this is just a quick graphic of how the governance works at a fairly large worker cooperative, Equal Exchange, which is headquartered in Boston. And some worker co-ops, you can see the owners, those employee owners, they elect a board of directors. And some co-ops will have only members as part of their board, whereas others, including PT360, choose to have some outside board members as well, who are appointed by the board to bring some additional perspectives to the company. That board of directors then hires and fires, the general manager, or in their case, they have the office of executive directors, and there's two executive directors there. And then those executive directors have hire and fire power over those worker owners. So, one of the things that is important to understand is even though someone's an owner, that if they're not doing their job, they can still be terminated. And then, so essentially their share is bought back, and see you later. So there's still pretty significant, managerial prerogative in these sorts of companies, but they're just kind of, also accountable. So you have this kind of circular flow of accountability, because you have this group of owners that all want to see the company succeed. So when folks are thinking about exiting to a worker co-op, there's a few considerations. When assessing feasibility, first of all, it's because employees need to be involved. Are employees interested and excited about the possibility of being co-owners? There's some companies where people are just kind of floating through, and it's not really sort of something that they see themselves in as long term, and maybe there's just not the energy for it. The second thing is, okay, so if there is the energy and the interest, is the employee group capable of taking on the buyer role? And if not now, what support needs to be in place for them to be able to legitimately assess this opportunity? So oftentimes we see employee groups work with the Small Business Development Center or other kinds of business advisors to help them kind of develop a business plan and assess the company and review a valuation report and things like that to really sort of get them to the point where they're saying, all right, this is something we want to do, and this is something that seems viable. Is there a clear management succession plan? So sometimes, and oftentimes, it's something where that business owner might be thinking, okay, and particularly in this moment, I think it's a question of all right, do I want to essentially be restarting my business, going into debt personally and then working 60 hours a week as the kind of in a restartup situation? Or would it be more appealing to do something where we can broaden the load a little bit in terms of other people kind of taking things on? And in something like that, then if the selling owner is in a key management role and they want to stay on, there's oftentimes we'll see situations where that's the case, where they sell the business but also buy in as kind of a co-employee owner. If not, then it's much more important to have kind of a clear short-term management succession plan to say, all right, well, is there, are those things that the selling owner would have taken on or had been doing, are those things that can be readily substituted for? So that's an important thing to just make sure is in place. And then there's of course the practical sense of, is the business saleable and financeable, right? Is the debt load sort of as a collateral? Is the valuation in the range of the seller's needs? And one thing that we'll get into momentarily is that there are a number of kind of friendly capital sources for these sorts of deals, these sorts of broad-based employee ownership deals specifically, that aren't necessarily available just for like a sale to manager or something similar. So that kind of, so there's some more flexibility there, and then also kind of that creativity in terms of some forms of seller financing to really kind of try to figure out exactly how to make this work best to set the company up for success, while also realizing, fair value for the current owner. And then this question of like, culture, right? Is there a history of teamwork? Is there, are there regular practices of sharing information? So people feel like that this is that there's trust, right? And so sometimes for folks who are thinking about this longer term, oftentimes kind of a first step, if they're like, okay, this is something I want to do in 5 years and not ready now, is to start to get certain practices in place that really sort of build that culture of collegiality and get people understanding and knowledgeable about the performance of the business. So things like open book management, for instance, can be a really powerful tool, where every month folks are kind of learning about a different bit of performance, and maybe even playing some little games, great game of business style, to sort of help move particular metrics. And so by the time that conversation, the owner's ready to have the conversation, the employees already have a are in the midst of a practice that keeps them up and aware on kind of the key financials of the business, so they're aware of how it's performing and can make a lot of that assessment a lot easier. And that sense of, okay, like, do I trust the business owner to be like wanting this, for the right reasons, and can I assess that, right? So if there's a strong, and then for the team itself, do people work well together? Can they see themselves as co-owners with each other, or are there kind of interpersonal conflicts that could potentially get in the way of that? So there's definitely some of that kind of culture and team building work that can lay the groundwork pretty powerfully. So in actually kind of going through the process of selling a business to this sort of co-op structure, there's kind of these sort of 5 key steps to walk through, right? So there's kind of exploring, which is really learning and motivating key decision makers. So there's a few folks in the employee group who really sort of like glom onto this idea and say, this is something I want to do. Other employees will often look to those folks as kind of as kind of leaders, and you'll oftentimes, and especially in larger companies, have kind of a steering committee of those kind of more passionate employees who can really sort of do the work on that needs to be done on their side of the transaction and drive it through. Once there's the sense of, okay, there's some there, this is appealing, then it's kind of moving into assessment mode, right? Checking feasibility, both in terms of financially, but also in terms of looking at, with a realistic perspective, those operational needs and all of that. Then, if it's like, all right, this is feasible, we've got a plan to be able to, run the company under the new structure, then it comes to designing the structures, right? So setting up the bylaws, talking to sources, capital providers, starting in on management training if that's needed, and figuring out, essentially, forming that proto board of directors that will then kind of be on the buy side of the transaction, and then ultimately incorporating the entity that's going to buy the business. And then, then you have your legal transaction, pay the lawyers, sign the documents, draw down the loan funds, all of that. And then once you've passed that, then kind of this new employee-owned business, has this continuing work to build the ownership culture, educate both the current and new employee owners, and also engage in broader support networks of other co-ops and other things that really can sort of help share best practices and things like that. So in terms of the financing, one kind of key consideration, you could probably infer from the discussion of the share price not being connected to the valuation of the company, is that they usually those shares themselves usually constitute a small percentage of the sale price of the company. I'd say probably the 2 to 10% range is where it most often lands, with some exceptions. So significant outside financing is usually needed, because oftentimes you have folks who are working in these companies that don't have a lot of wealth. So sometimes conventional lenders, although one of our roles is really to talk to those sorts of folks, can be unfamiliar with the details of the model. in turn, and especially small business lending, the assumption that there's one person with a personal guarantee and all of that. There's been some work kind of within the SBA to try to shift these personal guarantee requirements for co-ops off of co-ops. And there's a bill passed in 2018 that was aimed at doing that, but there's still kind of rulemaking and work around that. So, but the personal guarantee issue can be tricky, especially unless it's a very small co-op, because it's two reasons. One is there's kind of an equity issue where there might be some employee owners who have a lot of personal assets, right? And they have a house, cars, late career. And then there's other folks who might have very little. So if both people are guaranteeing, one person is a lot more at risk than the other. And then there's the fact that because the co-op allows for kind of fairly smooth onboarding and offboarding of owners, the question of who, okay, someone who was kind of a key person guarantor because they had assets is, now leaving for a different role. Do all the documents need to be written up, et cetera. So a lot of the kind of more specific co-op specific capital providers tend to not require personal guarantees. But for conventional lenders, that can be something that requires some education and negotiation. So the two common co-op financing vehicles are debt and preferred stock. Debt is pretty self-explanatory. Preferred stock is essentially these sort of behaves very similarly to interest-only debt, but it's equity on the balance sheet, where it's so buy a share usually as a fixed value. We'll pay before any profits are shared with workers. We'll pay target dividend, usually the 4 to 6% range that I've seen. And then the co-op can kind of buy it back at some later date. So going into just capital sources, right? Those member shares that I mentioned, usually, especially if there's outside debt, those lenders are going to want to see some seller skin in the game. Which could look like a simple note, most common, as I mentioned before. Kind of this, I think we're in a moment where earnouts are going to see a significant opportunity because they could allow folks to share in the upside, whereas otherwise kind of the face value valuation might be fairly depressed. In terms of institutional debt and equity, particularly it's worthwhile to talk to an existing bank or credit union or whoever the company has a relationship with, because they might be willing to be more flexible to keep that relationship with the new entity. Then probably the biggest player in our region is the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a community development financial institution. And they specialize in lending into cooperatives, so they know the whole personal guarantee issue. They can be creative in working around that. And so they're able to do loans of usually up to $1 million. I think the biggest they've done is $1.5 million. Our organization has a revolving loan fund that can do up to $50,000, usually as a participation with a Cooperative Fund of New England loan. Vermont Economic Development Authority does have instruction from the legislature to prioritize lending to employee ownership deals. So we've seen them participate in a few such deals. And then the Vermont State Employees Credit Union actually has an equity fund called Co-op Capital that that is interested in kind of placing kind of preferred shares on fairly flexible and favorable terms. It's kind of part of sort of a mission-driven type fund. And their policy allows them to do up to $150K per deal. Then there's also the question of kind of community raise, and this can look like small scale thing, right? Kind of the traditional kind of going to friends and family for loans and equity, and we've definitely seen that in a number of cases, both for debt and equity. There's one example where the financing was just they needed to shift the debt service coverage ratio a bit. And so they went to sort of the members primarily and said, hey, in addition to your share, if anyone's willing to make a loan to the co-op at these terms that'll push us into the range we need, here would be the terms. And they were able to raise an additional $25,000 that got them over the line. And then going to the public, and we've seen this actually sort of just south of Brattleboro and Greenfield, Mass. It's kind of one of the classic case studies of this. There's a worker cooperative called Real Pickles that had very loyal consumer following, and so they ended up doing a direct public offering of preferred shares and raising close to $1 million through doing that in order to both kind of do their conversion from a sole proprietorship with a founder, but also to fund some expansion and working capital. So there can be some, depending on, especially for B2C companies, there can be some opportunities there to tap into goodwill and turn it into capital. So that kind of covers my overview of the model and kind of how one could sell to one of these structures. So I'd like to turn it over for a few minutes to Deb Harris, one of the founding member owners of PT360, a physical therapy co-op in Northern Vermont that has now I believe three locations, to talk a little bit about their story and experience with this model. So Deb, let me pass it on to you.
Great. Well, I think that PT360 is kind of a storybook of what a worker cooperative can be. We worked from the get-go with the Vermont Employee Ownership Center and Steve McGowan, and just seeing, what our vision was and describing what we wanted for a company. And they had said, you're talking about a worker co-op. So Don Jameson and Steve McGowan early on were very instrumental in really helping us to shape what our company structure was going to be. I mean, we knew moving into it that we wanted a business with autonomy, that where we could focus on our different skill sets, where we could capitalize on the different specialties that people brought to the table and the strength of our group as a whole. We also knew we wanted to deliver healthcare unlike any of our competitors, and we wanted to share in the financial risk and the decision making in our company. And we also really were passionate about becoming more active in the community. So, having brought those, what our dream was, learning that, there is such a thing, it's called a worker co-op, we started the building blocks from the get-go. So we were not a transition or a conversion company. We opened up a clinic in August of 2010 in Burlington. By December, we opened up another clinic in Williston. But initially, we were 12 owners. We didn't have a lot of money. We had preferred share stock, so people that were family members that put up money for us to start. But again, we were on a shoestring budget, so we didn't pay ourselves vacation, we didn't pay ourselves for holiday, sick time, until we all could be paid. Everybody could be paid their paychecks. When we signed, like you had said, Matt, you were talking about the loans, and when we started PT360, we had to all sign. 12 original owners signed the personal guarantees. And after the first year, when they saw where our profit margin was, we actually were able to get out of the personal guarantee. But you talk about skin in the game when you look at dropping in a saltwater pool and having 2 clinics running out of the gate. That's a high guarantee for each person. With each ownership, we talked about how can we raise our standards of practice? How can we be different? And what we started early on was we had criteria. So all of the owners had to volunteer a set amount of time for something in the community. We had to do more outreach. We had to serve as a non-paid, on a board of directors within the community. And all of the owners were tasked with developing an exercise program that was medically directed. And what we found is that the results were astonishing. Within 2 years, the Burlington clinic tripled its size. Within year 8, we now have redoubled the Burlington clinic size. We maxed out our Burlington clinic. We took on the Williston clinic, we took on an additional 2,000 square feet. We opened up a Shelburne clinic. And as of last year, we opened up a 4th clinic in the Rev Studio. So we've seen a lot of growth through the years until COVID. And that was something completely different for us because it kind of brought everything to a screeching halt. So through COVID, it made us really kind of have to reset and start over. During COVID, we got through it through the PPP loans and the CARES loan is what has helped our company. But we're not 12 original owners. I mean, of the original owners, we have 4 left, and we've taken on 14 new owners for a total of 35 people. So, when you look at paychecks and 4 clinics and overhead and rent and utilities, et cetera, we were kind of worrying when we were told that we couldn't treat patients and it was a stay at home. But luckily, we were considered an essential. And so through the governor's mandate, We followed the CDC guidelines, and through the COVID, we treated urgent patients only. So those are patients that would have gone to the ER, for acute low back pain, those types of things that we are trying to keep them out of the hospitals and stuff. We were seeing people in the clinic, and it was like 3 or 4 patients a week. It was not like we were seeing a lot of patients. And then we started treating non-urgent patients once the mandate was lifted. And we did telehealth to get us through. But it has been a reset. So we're slowly starting to ramp up our business again, because patient confidence. And, they're worried about, with telehealth, their confidentiality. They're worried about coming into the clinic because of all the fear of COVID. So we've had kind of a slow start in ramping patients back into the schedule. Over the years, as we've developed, we've put in lots of different things. And the time I have is not, I couldn't even scratch the surface on that. When we've looked at projects that have been put in our lap, whether it's taken over another company or expanding into another area, we actually have developed a whole system where it's a packet. We get a group of people together and they do all the research. They go and look at the space, they look at the demographics, they look at what's around it. So there's a whole packet of stuff and criteria we look at. They bring it back to the owners, and then we would vote on it whether or not we wanted to move forward. We've also developed a cooperative class for the onboarding of new owners. And we watch We the Owners documentary. There's a PowerPoint presentation, and we go through basically what our core values are, our mission statement, what our history is, and kind of our vision moving forward. So we have now just a whole onboarding system to try to train and transition employees to owners. And as we've lost our original owners, we've really been looking at succession planning. How are we going to transition founding owners out of these key roles within our company? What does that look like? How are we going to, we're going to mobilize people from within our co-op? If so, that includes mentoring, that includes additional training, and really duplicating skills within the company so that we can make that retirement transition a little bit smoother within our company. But like every other company, I love to hear these presentations. I love to learn and grow, because you always get a little tidbit that you're like, oh, that would be great. That would work for us. So, that's kind of our story. And we've got growing pains just like everybody else. Is that what you were looking for, Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Deb. So maybe we can do, as was suggested earlier, a quick round of if anyone has, wants to introduce themselves and has any kind of like questions that have kind of come up from Deb's story or the presentation. Now would be a good time to just kind of throw them out.
Yeah, if we could just, go around, introduce ourselves and, what we're representing, and then, if there are any questions. If not, we can move on to the next person. So, Mike, you are first in my lineup.
Morning, Mike Kamenga. I'm one of the 4 owners of Long Pulse Paperboard here in Brattleboro.
Great.
We bought the mill in December of 2018, and enjoying our slice of heaven. One question that I had, Deborah, for you would be, if you could change one thing about how you set up the co-op, what would it be?
I don't think I would change anything, because I think that we started out so incredibly strong. I think where we started having growing pains is once we started expanding, and our overhead became so much higher, then you really need to continue to grow at that level to continue to pay the debts that you're, what I mean? The additional space and the additional rent. And so I wouldn't say initially. I think initially it was really smooth with the preferred shareholders and the money, and having bought most of them out. Like we'll have paid off year 10 our last preferred shareholder. So I wouldn't have changed that. It's more as we've grown that I think we've had more challenges.
Great. Thank you. Michael.
Hi, I think you're talking to me.
That's you.
Mike Moros, Vermont Photonics. I find this very interesting, but I do not have any questions.
Okay, great. Don, do you just want to introduce yourself? Although you probably don't have any questions.
Oh, yeah, I'm Don Jamison. I'm the other co-director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. I'm just spying on Nat and seeing how the presentation's going. Always interested in, seeing who's there. And, we're happy to answer any questions and work with you all.
Great. Marianne?
Hello. I'm the director of the Hannah Graham Center in Keene, and just really interested in, we've had a number of businesses locally that have just been legacy businesses in the region, and people retire and close their business, and it just seems like such a waste. So that's one thing, and then also just how do we, spread wealth a little bit better and have people be able to build up more capital, and we love the cooperative thing. For the Radically Rural Summit this fall, we're doing one of our sessions in the entrepreneur track is going to be on cooperatives, a wide range, but so part of my interest is there too, but it just seems like a great model to share out. No questions. Good presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Steve? No, Steve, I'm not sure if you're on the phone or not. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the phone. Steve, can you hear us?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have video on. Hi, I'm Steve Connor. I have a small consulting firm. We focus on marketing technology for businesses, and I'm mostly curious. I've been to a few of these sessions by knowing RT, and mostly curious because I don't know much about the co-op model, but just thinking about that in contrast to kind of the traditional partnership model that consultancies are typically built on, and trying to understand more of, as we look to bring on more junior members to our consultancy, would this type of model make sense?
Great.
Yeah, and certainly there are a number of examples of consulting firms that have used this, and and I would say if anyone's interested in more specific questions related to your business, VEOC is always happy to set up the time for a phone call, or you can shoot email questions to us just at info@veoc.org. And then I'd say a final just kind of thing in terms of if you're interested in doing more research. On the ESOP model, the National Center for Employee Ownership has a fabulous resource library, just NCEO. And then on the co-op side, the Democracy at Work Institute similarly has really put together a lot of different resources around both financing, governance, sort of all the different kind of pieces of the puzzle. So if you're looking for places to go for further information, those would be kind of my top two recommendations. And then the VEOC does an annual conference that will be online this year because COVID, of course. It usually is early June. We're doing it on August 18th, and certainly we'd be happy to send along info on that as well. So, but thank you very much for having us.
Yeah. RT, sorry, I skipped over you.
No, that's okay. Have you folks ever, Matt, have you ever worked with a franchise owner? I don't know if franchise agreements allow for these types of transitions.
Yeah, yes, we've had a number of conversations, and it depends on the franchise. So for instance, there are several Ace Hardware store affiliates that have used a worker co-op as an exit. There's one in upstate New York, there's another one in Maine. And Ace Hardware is in fact itself a form of cooperative that's owned by the franchise owners. So there might be that might be a reason that they're more flexible around it. There's others, but really depends on the particular company, what their expectations for the franchisees are. But certainly it's worth kind of exploring.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Well, just being mindful of the time, it is 1:02. And so if there are any questions left over, speak now. If not, we can head into the afternoon. I can send a link out to everyone with the recording of this, and I will also put Matt's email on there. And then Matt, if you want to send me maybe some of those link resources, as well as the conference that you have coming up, I can put all that information in the email as well.
Wonderful.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the sunshine.
Yep, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Take care.